Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Articulate Fly. On this episode, Jake Villwock of Relentless Fly Fishing in Pennsylvania returns to the podcast. As we head into the heat of summer, we thought it'd be a good idea to bring Jake back to talk about Topwater smallmouth. Jake shares his tips and tricks and updates us on his latest book project. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend, and please subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. It really helps us out. And we're already preparing for 2026, and we would like to hear from you. If you're willing to have a short conversation with me about what you like and what we can do better at the Articulate Fly or the Butcher Shop, shoot me an email or DM me on social media. All of our links are in the show notes. And finally, a shout out to our sponsor, Trout Routes. We all know streams are getting crowded, and chances are you're not the only one at your local access point. Get away from the crowds and busy gravel lots by using Trout Routes Pro with over 350,000 access points mapped across 50,000 trout streams and much more. Trout Routes has all the data you need to help you find angling opportunities that others will overlook. Up your game and download the app today. Use code ARTFLY20, ARTFLY20, all one word, for 20% off of your Trout Routes Pro membership at maps.troutroutes.com. Now, on to our interview. Well, Jake, welcome back to the Articulate Fly.
It's so good to be here.
There you go. I feel bad for you that you got a ton of rain last night. And you're going to probably, sounds like you're going to be off the water for probably 4 or 5 days, right?
At least, yeah. I might try to see if some of the smaller creeks clear out by Thursday or Friday, but definitely not going out tomorrow. That's for sure.
Yeah, there you go. Well, you can beat the weekend Costco rush. I think the last time I saw you was in Lancaster at the Lancaster show. Putting aside, I know you've had a fair amount of rain, but how's your spring smallmouth season been?
It's been really good. It's been a little strange. We had some like super warm weather in March, and then about the time the bass started migrating, it got really cold. And so for like the first 2.5 to 3 weeks, it was in the 40s every day, 30s at night, and there was like a period probably around the 14th or 15th of April that within 3 days the water temps went from 48 to 62. And so we had a really early spawn, and then we kind of got low water. So it was, there wasn't a lot of fresh fish coming in. Like we normally get 3, 4, 5 different waves of fish. And so then towards the beginning of May, we got blown out, and I thought all those fish were going to disappear because there was no new fish coming in. And I had heard reports from some guys that said the fish were spawning on some of the bigger rivers because they weren't coming up. And, honestly, after that water went down, I told my one client, I said, we might just be catching little fish. I don't know what's in here. And it was just bonkers for the next 2 weeks. So we got a fresh push of fish that came in. I was on the water last Friday, and we had fish still on beds on some of the creeks. So there's been another wave of fish that came in the last couple of weeks too. So it's been an interesting year for sure. But this is the first time that I've been able to fish the smaller creeks into the middle of June in probably 6 years. So it's been all right.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. So I guess you're a little bit different than maybe the Midwest or kind of down where I am, that you have, like the Susquehanna is huge, right? So you've got a lot of tributaries. So you actually have maybe some more kind of small water options than we have down here in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, in our spring season, basically mid-March until at least this year, mid-June, we're pretty much fishing. Most of us are pretty much fishing all the smaller creeks. And I'll be honest, it's so much fun. If I could fish the small creeks all year long, I would. But, they are, very rain influenced. So, they get pretty unfloatable by July. So we're back to the big water. But yeah, it's a different fishery than some of the Western stuff that I've done or the Midwest stuff that I've done, where, you're kind of changing locations as the season progresses, which is kind of fun. It gives you a different, view of scenery throughout the year. So
Yeah, it keeps you from getting on a first name basis with people at takeouts that are doing things they shouldn't do at boat ramps, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have about 7 different tributaries that we float. So, one really neat thing that happens down here is, well, at least in the past, this year was a little weird, but a lot of times in the southern end of the fish of the system, we've got fish that spawn towards the end of typically towards the end of April, and then some of the northern creeks, the fish are just starting to come in. So we have the ability to fish for 3.5 months basically over fresh fish or falling back fish, and we never have to worry about fishing over the spawn because we've got so many different creeks that are different, water temperatures and levels and stuff. So it's a pretty, it's a pretty unique, fishery for sure. And if you're willing to drive, you can, drive 2 hours to get to some of these creeks. And, typically the further you are from Harrisburg, the less people you're going to see. So, me personally, I like making that drive, even though at the end of the day, it kind of wears on you, but it's part of the gig.
Yeah, there you go. And so it's interesting because I know that like the funky spring weather we had, it is kind of you made the periodical cicada hatch kind of atypical this year. But I do know that they're kind of firing up in your part of the world. But I know there's also, some smallmouth guys don't really care about the periodicals and it's really a carp guy thing, kind of where do you come down on that?
Man, I'll anything that'll get a bass to rise, I'll take it. We don't have so we had our periodicals down in kind of the Harrisburg area uh 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And unfortunately the entire time the water was blown out. Um but where the state college area's got them pretty heavy, and the upper end of the Juniata is going to have them. I'm actually, if there were bass on them, I'd be all about it. But I'm actually getting ready to take my flats boat up to State College and fish a couple of lakes up there on the flats for carp and largemouth. But yeah, so I mean, if we had them and the bass were rising, I'd be all about it. I mean, I definitely tried to follow it really closely when it was closer to us and on the majority of the Juniata, but we are blessed that, we have a 3-year difference between the State College 17-year hatch and the Cumberland Valley 17-year hatch. So it's kind of neat that you don't have to wait a full 17 years to fish them.
Yeah. And so I guess, would you rather, when the cicadas are out, would you rather chase carp or would you rather chase bass?
Oh, that's a tough question. Definitely bass. For sure, definitely bass. However, carp would be a very close second because, the carp where we are, like, especially on the bigger rivers, are super hard to catch in the summertime. They're very weary, and if you're trying to do it in a boat, it's almost impossible. So whenever we get a chance where it's quote unquote easier, I jump on that. And I spend a little bit of time down in Florida chasing redfish. So this is a good, you know, kind of substitute for that up here and just kind of running around and fishing some of the flats and the edges of water. And so, yeah, I'm bass for sure. Carp very close second.
There you go. And so, we're recording here almost in the middle of June, which is kind of, the jumping off place kind of in our part of the world for kind of the thick of, summer fishing. And that means topwater for smallmouth. And, we'll get to the bug stuff in a minute, but I also know that you like to fish topwater frogs for smallmouth. When's the best time to chase smallmouth with a frog?
Right now. Um, Honestly, one of the things that I started talking about recently in some of my presentations is that May and June are two of the best frog months when it comes to fishing for smallmouth. I know the guys in the Midwest do it a lot because there's frogs up there pretty regularly. But one thing that's super interesting about our ecosystem is that the frogs and the toads are mating at the same time that the smallmouth are migrating to spawn. So talking about matching the hatch in some way, the frogs are around, and the bass are willing to eat them. So if you can get water temps in the low to mid 60s, you can have absolute banner days on frogs this time of year. So it's also typically when the water flows are a little heavier, and now that the fishing pressure's gotten greater in the last 10 years, those bass don't react to frogs quite as well as they used to when the water gets low and clear. So when early season, May, June, July, early July, when the water's kind of typically on the higher level, those fish can tend to eat a little bit more aggressively on top so you can get away with frogs.
Got it. And so how long does your frog hatch last?
Honestly, it's kind of interesting that the frogs kind of mate first and then the toads start. I'm not really sure if fish know the difference between a frog and a toad. But the toads are spawning right now. So, I'd say 2 months, 2 to 2.5 months is the season we have for good frog fishing.
Yeah, and so is it something that, I don't know, like they're on them, like they'll be on cicadas, or is it something like you're fishing, you're like, well, let's see if we can get them on a frog today? I mean, kind of how does that work?
I think it directly relates to water temperature. So, once you start to see, like I said, that water in that mid 60s range, and the water, you know, levels or the clarity of the water is kind of that more, as we call like a big fish green, where there's like 2 or 3 feet of visibility, but not like gin clear. I would say it's more of like you start to hear them, and then when the conditions are right, you start throwing them. And so, the other thing is some of the creeks that we float in the springtime also have really great trout fisheries on them, on the upper ends of the creeks. And so they've got all the different mayflies and stuff. And so as soon as you start to see, bass rising to mayflies, it's a great time to start fishing frogs because they've got it enough. The water's warm enough that their metabolism and their energy levels up, and they're willing to kind of start jumping on those bugs or those frogs. So
Got it. And so what are your favorite frog flies?
my favorite is honestly the Umpqua swimming frog, the kind of Dave Whitlock, um, and what's the other guy's name? Larry Delberg. So Larry Delberg and Dave Whitlock were kind of the first two to pioneer the slider style frog. And so, for me, there's so many different bugs out there, and there's so many different, deer hair frogs. The thing that I like the most about the Umpqua swimming frog is how thin the head is. When you're throwing a bigger bug, it takes longer for that fish to get it in its mouth. And so when you've got some of those, kind of more bulky headed flies, your hookup ratio goes down significantly. But those Umpqua swimming frogs seem to kind of get wedged in their mouth a lot easier. And then, I get into some of the foam stuff. I do a lot of the double barrel poppers in chartreuse and yellow, and just kind of tie a traditional popper with legs coming or feathers coming off the back as legs. Those work really well, but honestly, we don't get a lot of opportunity to throw deer hair. So whenever we're frog fishing, I always have the Umpqua swimming frogs as my first go-to.
Got it. And so how do you like to present the frog?
Oh man, if I can throw it and I can present it super aggressively, that's what I want to do. Because frogs aren't actually that great of swimmers for like long distances. So like, when you're fishing a frog and you throw directly, inches off the bank and then pop it. Well, let me back up. What I like to do is let it hit the water, let the rings dissipate. And a lot of times before you even get a chance to pop it once, a fish is on it. But if the water conditions are right and they're a little bit higher, a little bit dirtier, I like to be pretty aggressive with the frogs, but definitely not as aggressive as we used to, or as aggressive as some people do with like largemouth, where it's kind of a constant bloop, 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 bloop. I like to pop it pretty hard and let it sit for 2 or 3 seconds. Pop it, let it sit for 2 or 3 seconds. Or if the water's a little lower, then I just like to pull it. I like to create the wake, but just like fishing a streamer, I think the pause is what gets those fish, going. And I can probably tell you that 80% of the fish that we catch on frogs are during that time where the frog's not moving. So, and it's a pretty aggressive eat because they're like, "Ooh, when's it going to move again? I got to get it now." So that's how I do it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I kind of think about, like watching frogs, and they usually, when they swim, it's kind of like, they go under and kick and glide and come back up, right?
Yep.
And it's usually not sustained.
Right. And it's the same thing with mice. We fish a lot of mice for bass too, and mice are kind of the same. They create a wake. They don't create a lot of loud noise. So as long as you can create that disturbance, and then just depending on what your flow is and what the clarity is, directly correlate that to the amount of noise that you make with the frog. Um, and that's going to get you the most eats. But a lot of times when they're really on them, you literally just hit the water with the frog and you wait 2 seconds and you've got a fish on. So it's like sometimes you don't even get a chance to pop it. Um, and I say that about any type of top water. I might be jumping ahead here, but like the initial plop of the fly hitting the water is the most realistic sound of your entire presentation. So ride that out as long as you can because that's what those fish are keen in on is something hitting the water. Because no matter whether it's a cicada, a frog, a grasshopper, they're all going to hit the water and create some disturbance immediately. And then after that, it's kind of just imitating what the rest of that bug or that forage food does. So
Got it. And so when you want to wake, are you slowly stripping the fly or are you lifting the rod and kind of almost pulling the fly towards you?
I do a little bit of both. I like to pull the fly because you're connected the entire time. If you lift the rod and then drop it, you've got to kind of be on it to pick up that slack because a lot of times those fish eat it pretty aggressively. But the flip side of that is that just like a big brown trout eating a grasshopper out west, like sometimes the longer you wait, the better chance you have to hook that fish. So, um, a little bit of slack's not bad, but typically what I do, and I tell most of my clients to do is just kind of a 12 to 18 inch pull, just like you're stripping a streamer and just pull it and let it sit. Um, if we're on anchor, that's another kind of interesting way to do it. What I typically do is have either myself or one of my clients cast slightly upstream, and then you're presenting that fly as a mend instead of a strip, so you can get a longer parallel drift to the bank versus like stripping it off the bank further and further away. You can, kind of cast it upstream, let it float from 5 or 6, feet, then throw another mend in it, a little mend, not a big one, little mend in it. That frog slides or pops a little bit. You pick up the slack, and now you're running kind of like I said, parallel to the bank for longer. And that's a great way to do it too. So instead of actually stripping it in, you're mending it, picking up the slack, mending it, picking up the slack.
Got it. And obviously you're fishing them on a floater, but kind of what's your preferred kind of rod, reel, and line and leader setup?
So in the last 2 years, I've really got into like the 7 weights for that. You can definitely get away with throwing an 8 weight. You can throw a 6 weight, but frogs are kind of big. So I think the 7 weight gives you the most control. It also lands on the water a little bit softer. So set 9 foot 7 weight is definitely my go-to when it comes to frogs. I do like the scientific angler bass bug line for fishing frogs. That's what it was designed for. So, you can get away with a 7 weight line, which is technically a 9 weight, be a green weight for the line. So, um, it's just turns that fly over a distance further. When I'm fishing frogs, leader length, I'm typically in that kind of 8 foot range, 7.5 to 8 foot range, because the bigger the bug, this is one of my kind of rules of thumbs or guidelines is, the bigger the fly, the shorter the leader, because you can't turn over a big streamer. You can't turn over a big frog with a 9, 10, 11 foot, 12 foot leader. So typically I like to stay in that 8 foot leader section or length for frogs. So 9 foot 7 weight, scientific angler, bass bug line, and an 8 foot leader. Poundage wise for the tippet, anywhere from 12 to 20 pounds, just depends on, what the clarity is and things like that. So,
Got it. And you got a favorite flavor rod?
I love Scott rods. That's pretty much all I fish now. The Scott centric 9 foot 7 weight, in my opinion, is one of the most fun bass rods or frog rods that you can have. It's definitely got a little bit softer of a tip to it, but um, it's got a really nice backbone to turn over those bugs. So it's a great rod for that. Um, but any fast action rod is great, but Scots are definitely the only thing on my boat.
Well, there you go. Well, before we get to bugs, what other kind of non-bug topwater situations do you like to fish?
Ooh, non-bug topwater. Um, so the um, what the heck is that thing called? There's like that that foam spook that's out there. That fish chase flies guy, I forget his name, but he ties those things. So I like to throw bait fish topwater, especially in the fall. Um, but I've gotten into, kind of that spook kind of glide bait, if you will, on top, which is super fun. But that's pretty much it. I mean, if it's not some sort of bug, the only other thing would be just, if we don't see a lot going on, just throwing regular poppers, Google bugs and things like that. But I typically try to imitate whatever is around. And if I don't have a lot of stuff, or, water temps are different, then I just stay subsurface, and that'll be the end of it. So
Yeah, I guess. And so for kind of, let's just say the standard kind of non-summer bug stuff, do you prefer open face poppers, sliders? I mean, is there a kind of a preference there? Any kind of colors or anything like that that you like, one more than the other?
um I like the um kind of more of that open face deal. I don't do a lot of slider fishing personally, but if it's chartreuse or yellow, those are my two favorite colors. I mean, Google bugs have the solar flare, which is that like yellowy chartreuse, and then they have yellow fellow, which is just straight yellow. Those are probably the two most popular prospecting bugs that I use, and those are, I think they come in uh, a 4, 6, and an 8. I really like the sixes, the mid size one. They're easy to cast. They create enough disturbance, and they're super super easy for those fish to get in their mouth. So when you talk about hookup ratio, that kind of mid-sized boogle bug is definitely, the king of that, if you will, king or queen.
Yeah, there you go. And I would imagine, right, tackle's the same, except if you have a smaller bug, you're using a longer leader.
Yes. Yep. Yep. Exactly. So, when we get into that summertime situation, there's times where we're running 12 to 14 foot leaders, which, a lot of people don't like to do. But in my personal opinion, I love that kind of technical dry fly fishing, where you've got to have the long leader. It's got to be, presented properly and, quietly, but still within, earshot of the fish. So, and typically when we get to that level, we're starting to sight fish on top water, and that to me is the coolest thing ever. So,
Yeah, and to kind of help manage frustration at the bow of the boat, how far do you need people to be able to cast in the summertime? Because I know the fish get spooky, right? And so, obviously longer can generally be better, but kind of people are in the backyard practicing for a trip. What do they need to be able to do?
I mean, minimum summertime's 50 feet. And to a lot of people, like, that seems like a lot, but it's really not. I mean, typical shooting heads on fly lines are 30 feet. So, if you think about, basically casting a 10-foot leader plus the shooting head, you're already at 40. So, an extra 10 feet's not that far. And, you're throwing smaller bugs. So you don't have to worry about, a super heavy fly, falling too quickly, or, collapsing your cast and things like that. So, I'd say 50 feet, but, most people could probably already do that without even realizing they can do that. And so, 60, 70 is never a bad thing. But then the further you get, then you run into the issue of, when that fish eats you, you're going to be able to set the hook on it. So, I try to get them to within 50 feet, and that seems to be the sweet spot of just far enough for everything to work.
Got it. And so, kind of in your neck of the woods, when do you shift over to kind of what, I would consider kind of traditional topwater bug fishing for smallmouth?
It depends on the flows, of course, but um, typically we're that last week of July, first week of August. We start to get those lower flows. Those fish are starting to pattern. Different mayflies. The annual cicadas are out. We get a pretty good summer sulfur and kale hatch on our rivers. And on any given day, depending on flows, you can see fish, bank to bank, sitting inches under the surface, patterning those bugs, which is super fun. We also get a bunch of blueing olives, which are typically really, really tiny in the summertime, but, they're bass, they're not trout. So if you throw a smaller olive anything in front of them, they're going to eat it. So, I'd say end of July, early August, and then we'll kind of run that until everything slows up, in the middle to end of September. So.
Got it. And so it sounds like, I mean, I know we've got like dragonflies and we've got mayflies, kind of in Virginia and the Carolinas, but sounds like you've got, a whole kind of topwater level of action that has nothing to do with fishing cork bugs.
Yes, absolutely. We fish a lot of foam in the summertime, and again, when we get into those kind of low summer flows, our fish start to act a lot like spring creek trout. So, cork, as much as I love cork, it hits the water pretty hard no matter how good you are and how delicate you drop it. So, fishing foam is really, really important. And we fish old Mr. Wiggly's from the guys up in Wisconsin and tight lines. I've got a articulated damsel fly that I tie now that's, very similar in style of the Wiggly, but, different stone flies and grasshoppers and things like that. And, it's kind of fun. And one of the reasons I also switched to more of that foam bug stuff is because there's not an adult on this planet that if you put a popper on the end of their rod and tell them not to pop it, that they'll listen to you. So, no matter what happens, everybody wants to pop a popper. So I got so frustrated in that I was like, that's it. I'm cutting it off and you're getting something that you can't pop no matter how hard you tried it. So that's why we kind of switched over to some of that more foam stuff. But foam is also, again, the smaller you get, the more slender you get on profile, the easier it is to get in a fish's mouth. And so, again, hookup ratio seems to go up, even more once you get into that kind of slender foam bug. So
Interesting. So you don't fish, say, for example, like some of the Chuck Craft style kind of hard cork bugs?
I do. I do that typically earlier in the season. So July would be kind of the time frame that I fish that. I love the Excalibur. I have some of his damselflies. Those do work, but those Excaliburs are pretty heavy. So the only time, kind of dead summer, August, September that I'll fish those is when we're kind of fishing banks that have, pretty low hanging trees where, it's not uncommon to see bigger bugs like cicadas fall out of them, because when they hit the water, it's a pretty big flop. I mean, we were fishing State College on Friday. I guess the last time I bass fished was Thursday, because Friday we went trout fishing. We went up and fished the cicadas on one of the spring creek, or one of the creeks up in State College, and we were throwing the cicadas in the water, and even just us throwing them kind of fluttering down, 20 feet, they still hit the water pretty hard. So that's where Chuck Craft's bugs really, really come out, I think, is when those bigger bugs are around. So.
Got it. So why don't you give me, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 of your kind of favorite topwater flies for smallmouth?
So one of mine is the Russ Madden Scorpio. I think that's how you say it. It's a kind of a foam bug with some rubber legs and some deer hair coming off the back. Tie it in a lot of different colors. It can kind of imitate, anything. I know if you're a fly tyer, you can find that. Find the recipes for that, but it's also a Montana Fly Company pattern, so you can purchase that. The old Mr. Wiggly is probably my number one, summertime bug when it comes to foam. The Streambank Hopper is a Western grasshopper. That's one of my favorite grasshopper patterns for the summer. And then my new articulated damselfly, that's definitely one of my more favorite ones. But I'll be honest with you, those are the main four that I fish. I don't go super deep in different patterns when it comes to like topwater, because I know that if they don't eat one of those four, there's not a lot of other stuff you can throw that you're going to get those fish to eat. They're either just not eating or you're not presenting it properly. So, there's plenty of different grasshopper patterns out there and things like that, but those are my top four. So.
Got it. So you're probably, using your 7-weight Scott. Have you changed your fly line and your leader approach drastically for those bugs?
That is a great question. And yes, I do. So, one thing you can do now, me being a guide and having, the ability to have different, reels and spools and lines is kind of nice. But I tell a lot of people that if they can't have multiple fly lines for topwater, to just buy bass bug or whatever bass bug line they have, one line weight lighter, because technically it's still a line weight heavy. So for instance, if I was fishing the SA bass bug, 7 weight for frogs, on my 7 weight in the summertime, you could run a 6 weight bass bug on your 7 weight, and that's still going to give you plenty of power to, cast that fly at good distance, but it's not going to hit the water super hard. But my fly line of choice is the new SA Infinity Plus, which is basically a line heavier 40-foot shooting head. So it's a little bit longer. So it's not great for short casts. But again, typically when you're running those lighter fly lines, you're trying to cast further. So the SA Infinity Plus is my favorite summertime one. Still running 7 weights occasionally. If we're running super small stuff, I'll run a 6 weight, but 7 weights seem to be, pretty versatile when it comes to presenting something softly or still wanting to punch something big through the air. So it's the, kind of jack of all trades, if you will, fly rods. So
I got it. So we now know that you yell at people that pop poppers, right?
I do.
And you take
absolutely,
and you take them away, but you've got a lot of different kind of dry flies, right? For lack of a better word. It seems like maybe some of them you animate and some of them you don't. You want to kind of walk through that for folks?
I am a very strong proponent of the dead drift. So, I what I typically do when I get into those smaller quote unquote dry flies is, instead of popping it or stripping it, what I basically do is tell the client to lift their rod about 6 inches, and that'll pull the fly, or it'll just barely move it depending on how far it is away, just creating a little bit of a ripple around that bug. Otherwise, I'm leaving pretty flat. One thing I will say is that I'm convinced that there is what I've now dubbed the zone of interest around a smallmouth, and it's about an 8 foot circle from its gill plates to the front of its nose. And when you're dry fly fishing, casting that fly, whatever it is, within that 8 foot range is almost always going to get their attention. So I tell people, and you can tell exactly who's a traditional dry fly trout fisherman versus a bass angler, because the trout fisherman is going to cast their wiggly or their grasshopper 30 or 40 feet in front of that bass that's sitting just under the surface. They're going to mend it, get this beautiful drag-free drift down to that fly or down to that fish. And the fish is either going to completely ignore it, or you're going to, as the angler, when it gets close, try to pop it, and you're going to spook that fish. So I tell everybody it's 100% chance that fish is going to ignore your fly or get spooked if you try to, lead that fish super far. But if you can drop that fish or drop that fly within an 8 foot circle of the front of that fish, you're going to almost always get their attention. Whether or not they eat it or not, that's kind of up to you and the fish at that point. But, like I said before, that plop is what gets their attention. That's the most natural sound of your presentation. Now, once that fish comes up and starts looking at your fly, then you have to decide if that fish is interested in that bug. Is it looking at it because it's going to eat it, or is it looking at it because it wants to know if it's alive before it eats it? So that's when a little tiny twitch comes in, where I'm just like, lift your thumb an inch so that fly barely moves. And a lot of times that fish, immediately as that fly goes to move, will jump on it and eat it. Or there are plenty of times where that movement spooks the fish. But if you put it in an 8 foot circle in front of that fish, I guarantee you're going to get that fish's attention. So.
Got it. And I would imagine you want to put it on kind of your side of the 8 foot circle so you don't risk lining the fish or them seeing the line, right?
Yep, that is true. If you're on the far side of them by a foot or two, that's probably not that big of a deal, just because the leader's not going to create that much disturbance. But I can't tell you how many times I ask a client, like, you see that fish over there at 35 feet, and they're like, yep. I'm like, all right, put that fly right in front of that fish. And the the fly line hits it in its head, and so there's plenty of times where, the cast isn't made properly, but as long as you get that fly quietly in front of that fish, they will come up and look at it.
Got it. And so, you're, we were talking before we started recording, you're kind of, headquartered south of Harrisburg. And, so, kind of what you're talking about, maybe not all of the kind of, mayflies and things like that, but, generally, the arcs of the smallmouth season are similar. They just kind of start and end at different times across the country. So, if someone is listening to this and they're not in the PA area, or they're down near me, or they're in the Midwest, or, maybe even down like in Tennessee, what are your tips for, helping them figure out kind of where they are kind of in the smallmouth season on their home waters?
Best thing to do is always be checking water temperatures. I feel like the majority of smallmouth seasons directly correlate with water temperatures. So, whether or not you're in the Midwest, their spring might start a little bit later than us. Down in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, they might start a little earlier than us, just depending on what water temps are. So, always pay attention to everything that you can look at. I mean, we have these super, ridiculously smart computers in our hands at all times, so you can see, what the weather's doing, what the flows are doing. And so I always just say water temperature. That's the short answer of it. And then just observe what else is going around. Start looking to see if you see bugs. Do you hear cicadas? Do you hear crickets and grasshoppers? When you're walking through the grass to get to the boat ramp, are there bugs jumping up just like, out west when you're walking to a spring creek? Are they kicking grasshoppers up like crazy? So just observe with what's going on around you and check water temps. Those are the two most important things.
Yeah, and I guess, not all USGS gauges have temperature, but a lot of them do. I do know that like Trout Routes has a lot of the I think, though, actually, they probably have all the USGS gauges, and you can get temperature information there.
Yep, you can do that. I always carry a thermometer with me. I've got one in the center console of my truck. So, if I'm going out to see what's going on, or, if I'm getting ready to go fishing, the first thing I do is throw that thing in the water, I try to drop it to the bottom and check the bottom temperature. And sometimes, for instance, like a lot of our boat ramps, we have a lot of jet boats on our big rivers. And so they blow out an 8-foot deep hole right below the boat ramp, so you can throw your thermometer in there attached to hopefully some string, and see what it is at 8 feet, and then you can throw it over, foot, over to the bank where it's a foot deep and see the difference in water temperature. But so I think thermometers are a great thing to have. I probably own like 12 of them because I always forget them. So I now have one in every single pack, bag, box, crevice and crack that I can put them in. So I never don't have one.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you don't do an infrared one. I know I've got one of the old fish pond ones that's in like an aluminum case.
Yeah, yeah. Honestly, I've just never had one. I've always just bought the either Umpqua or Scientific Angler or Orbis ones, the metal ones, and they tend to be pretty durable. I mean, so when I'm floating in my drift boat or my raft, a lot of times I'll throw it overboard. 3 hours later, I'll forget it was in the water, and it's still completely fine, just dragging on the bottom, attached to a 6-foot piece of, monofilament. So they're pretty durable. But if you can get a thermal one, that would be awesome. Does anybody still make those?
I don't know, because I just, I've got my old school one that works. And so I just, I don't really troll the catalogs for the ones that look like an infrared gun that you point at the water.
Right.
But yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting. Like, so for me with trout, I have mine on a carabiner that I actually like hook to my laces on my wading boots.
Yeah, perfect. Yep. That's a great idea.
Yeah. So you've gotten rained out. I don't want to give you PTSD or anything like that, but I also know you're working on another book. So maybe you have a few days to do book work. You want to, share details with our listeners about what you're working on?
Well, honestly, I'm done. So, that's good. But yeah, I just finished my second book. It is part of a series. So Stackpole started the series, I think 4 years ago. They did favorite flies books, and so there's favorite flies from Pennsylvania. There's a favorite flies for Colorado, and so it's going to be a series book. So I just wrote the favorite flies for smallmouth bass. And so I got 50 of what I would consider, that they're my favorite, but I would consider them the top 50 flies for smallmouth in, today's day and age. So, they're not just mine. I've got some from the guys at Schultz Outfitters. I've got some from, the guys at Tight Lines. I've got some from, the guys down in Virginia. And so I've got a wide variety of flies, to display for this book. But what's really neat about it is, you write, I took a picture of each fly. It's not a tutorial book. It's more of here are the 50 flies and, who created them, why they created them, and then how to fish them. And so, there's recipes for all of them. So there's, I think, 16 or 17 topwater, 16 or 17, mid column. So bait fish or swim flies, and then the same for the bottom with crayfish and hellgrammites and things like that. So, it was a smaller project than my first book, but it was super fun, and it's kind of awesome to be done with a second book. So
yeah, there you go. Didn't Naguski do the trout fly one for PA?
Yep. Naguski did the trout flies, favorite flies for Pennsylvania. I actually had his book sitting on my table the entire time I was writing it, just to make sure I was doing it right, like looking at how he did the recipes for each one and how many flies he added, different pictures and things like that too. And I actually, speaking of Naguski, I used his camera in his studio to take all of the photos of the flies, so that was pretty fun.
Yeah, that's we could do an entire interview on the nightmare of macro photography for flies for books, right?
You know what the worst part was like, you use these like little pieces of shale or something like that, and you make them wet so that they kind of glisten a little bit, and you take this awesome picture of this fly. It's all in focus, and then you blow it up on the computer, and you're like, there's 3 dry spots in it. So you gotta go back through and retake it again. So, but yeah, it was, I learned a lot because he's got all the stuff, the little like light reflectors and the big hood with the flash on it and all that stuff. And so, yeah, macro photography is kind of a pain. But my flies, being bass, are a little bit bigger than trout flies, so they weren't quite as bad as tying or taking photos of size 16 stone flies or nymphs or whatever.
Yeah, and you weren't developing film, which would have made it even worse because you would have had to wait 3 weeks to realize you'd screwed up the shot.
Exactly. I did make the mistake though of taking all the photos and then going home. I live about 30 minutes from Eric, and so I went home, put them on the computer, and I had to make a list of all the flies I had to re-photograph, and went back 2 days later, did it all over again. So it was kind of a pain, but again, super fun. And actually, because I was writing that book, I tied some flies that I hadn't tied yet, such as like Schultz's The Woodsman and the Leggy Boy. I hadn't really tied those flies before, and I kind of had to get really good at it to make them, photo worthy, and ended up fishing them a lot this spring, and they were just as effective as those guys said they were. So that's good.
Yeah, and I would imagine too, right? If you're done with the book, that probably means it'll be ready to launch kind of for the holiday season and show season in 2026, right?
Yep. As far as I know, it should be out right around the Edison show. They were thinking they might be able to have it done by, the holidays, Christmas time, but this is actually, from what I was told, and it could be because I was a little late on sending it in, but they're pretty busy on books this year, so I think it'll be beginning of 26 is when that book will come out. So
yeah, very cool. Any other projects you want to share with our listeners?
I don't really have anything else going on right now. Well, I guess the only other thing I will say is that that's not true. I have a huge project. I just signed a contract with Montana Fly Company, so they're taking all of my bass flies. So they're going to do a Jake Villwock signature launch next year. It's going to have 9 or 10 patterns. As I'm tying flies for samples right now, once they officially picked which ones they wanted, now I'm tying the samples for them, and tying samples of flies to send to somebody in the middle of guide season is quite painful because you spend all this time tying flies and you can't put them in your box. But I keep coming up with a couple new flies as I'm doing this, and I'm like, hey, what do you think of this one? They're like, yeah, send me a sample of that too. So as of right now, they've got 9, but they may have up to 11 when the actual launch happens next year. So that'll be pretty exciting.
It's pretty neat. I mean, gosh, those guys they're really kind of taking over kind of the streamer space in fly fishing.
100%. And you know what? I had a contract with Fulling Mills / Orvis for a long time, and that kind of contract expired, and it was just like the perfect storm and timing for me when Montana Fly reached out to me. But they sent me some flies from a couple different tires to photograph for the book, and I honestly could not tie that fly better myself. So, the quality of streamer tying is amazing, and the way they package them, they don't get all smashed and stuff. And so the quality control with MFC is pretty phenomenal. So I'm really excited to work with them, and it'll be nice to finally have what I would consider some of the more modern bass bugs available for people to purchase, because not every fly fisherman, or should I say fly angler, ties flies. So when people are like, oh, do you sell your roamer or do you sell your crayfish? I'm like, no, but maybe somebody else could tie them for you. And so it'll be nice to be like, no, I don't, but Montana Fly ties them as well as I do, so go buy them from them. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, these ties are involved, right? So even if you tie, you may not want to tie that, right?
Yeah, and I know that like when COVID hit, and we weren't allowed to guide, I spent the entire month of April. I threw the roamer and a couple other bass bugs back up on my website to purchase, and expected to get a few orders. And within 48 hours, I had 36 orders, and I was tying flies for 8 hours a day during COVID. And I just kind of realized that I never wanted to tie commercially again. And I also charged more because I didn't want to do it, and people didn't have any issues paying it because they wanted the fly. So at this point, I can't tie commercially because any fly that I tie besides these samples has to go in my fly box, because I don't have, well, right now I have plenty of time because the river's blown out, but unfortunately for me, I have a full box of flies, so I don't even get to tie flies. But yeah, so any bug that I tie has to go in my box. It's too valuable for my job.
There you go. And we haven't talked really about your kind of Relentless and everything you do there, but I will drop a link to our original interview in the show notes for this one. But before you go tonight, you want to let folks know, like you told me before we started recording, that you picked up State College. So you now are running all the guides at TCO. You want to kind of give folks kind of, the locations, and you're more than just, smallmouth, you're doing trout and other stuff too, kind of all that kind of good stuff, and how they can reach out and get on the water with you or one of your guides.
Yeah. So we do the trout stuff. So we've got TCO has 5 locations, one in Bryn Mawr, one in Reading, State College, Boiling Springs, and the most recent one is up in Muncie, PA. So kind of northern Pennsylvania, Pine Creek, West Branch, Susquehanna. So, one of the beauties of what we have is we have guides that are really good in each one of those locations. So we're not like a centrally located outfitter that just kind of goes here, goes there. And so we have, trout guides, we have steelhead guides, we have smallmouth guides, we have muskie guides. And so we do it all in Pennsylvania. And then the one other thing that we've got that's kind of neat is I have a guide that spends 3 months in North Carolina every fall, chasing false albacore and amberjack. So we also actually have a saltwater guide that works for us as well, which is kind of nice. So, if you want to do some saltwater, we've got you covered. If you want to trout fish, bass fish, or really any freshwater, game fish in Pennsylvania, or we can do that. We also have 2 licensed guides in New York. So they do the salmon river and for steelhead and West Branch of the Delaware. Neil Sunday is my head guide. He's actually up on the West Branch of Delaware right now for the next 3 weeks guiding. So it's we kind of do it all. And then most recently, we just started working with Bear Harbor, which is an online booking company. And so you can go to relentlessflyfishing.com and you can pick your location, pick your day, and then pick your guide, and book everything online right there. You get a confirmation email, you get a pre-trip packet. So we've made it pretty seamless to book stuff. But if you also have questions, you can send myself an email at relentlessflyfishing@gmail.com, or you can give any one of the TCO shop a phone call. And we've got somebody there at each location that can help you figure out what you want to do. So.
Well, it sounds pretty slick. Well, I appreciate you taking some time out of your rained out day to hang out with me and talk about topwater smallmouth bass. But before I let you go, you want to let folks know the best way to get in touch with you and follow your adventures, I guess, on the water, at the vise, and at the word processor.
Yeah, I mean, most of my stuff's on Instagram. So Relentless Fly Fishing is our page. We've got a website, relentlessflyfishing.com. That's got a blog that we update about 2 to 3 times a month with different fishing, techniques, different tying videos, things like that. Also have a YouTube channel, which is Relentless TV. Getting ready to drop a new cicada tying video. So I've got a cicada from 2 or 3 years ago when we had them right here. But while tying some cicadas the other day, I kind of came up with a new pattern. So that'll be out. So Instagram, YouTube, website, those are the main 3. And then, keep your eye out later in the season for the show schedule to come out for the fly fishing shows, because I'll be doing a bunch of those as well. So,
yeah, and I'll drop links to all that stuff in the show notes. And Jake, I'm sorry you're going to be off the water for a few days, but I appreciate you spending some time with me this evening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's part of this being a fishing guide. Some days you get them, some days you don't.
Yeah. Well, hopefully our paths will cross before Edison next year.
Yep. I think we should go fishing sometime soon.
There you go. Take care. Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed the interview as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Don't forget to check out the links to all of this episode's sponsors in the show notes. Tight lines, everybody.